out of the middle of this contact, machine gun fire, and we were returning fire, and over only tens of metres, a young boy and an old man wandered through the middle of the gunfight, and he'd been severely shot, severely wounded with head trauma. His brain was exposed, so he was a Pri 1 casualty.
Welcome to the podcast where we track down Australian war veterans, have a chat with them, and hear their stories. I'm Alex Lloyd, and this is Life on the Line.
The single greatest sacrifice I've made is my family.
We weren't out there to take country, we were out there to do something. That was our job.
I did feel a lot of regret.
Friends were still getting killed.
It got to the point where, you were going to funerals quite often.
Do I lead under fire?
And that was a heavy responsibility, I guess, on my shoulders that I didn't want to screw up.
War itself is horrific. It's a horror story. It should never be dressed up as if it's something glorious.
Not what you can do for yourself, but what can you do for your country.
The volunteer for service was in effect to put your life on the line.
Anthony Harry Moffitt served in the Australian Defence Force for almost 30 years, most of which was spent with Australia's elite Special Air Service Regiment as a team commander and team specialist. He has served in 11 active deployments, including being wounded in action in 2008. Harry completed his time with the SASR as its Human Performance Manager. He's a registered psychologist and runs a human performance consultancy, Stotan Group, working with sports teams, the military, and corporate world. His memoir, 11 Bats, was a bestseller. Today, he lives in Melbourne. Harry is a recurring guest on this show. I first interviewed him about his military career in Season 3, in number 68, Harry Moffitt.
4 helicopters landing under gunfire, coming in, hitting the aircraft, landing at the same time, and just taking a split second to look to the left and the right out of the helo and see guys launching out of helos and running towards the gunfire. That's a magic moment.
He returned in Season 4 to discuss his memoir. In number 68, Harry Moffitt Vol II.
The leader is there to hold the light in the dark, to show the way forward.
Harry is back on the show today to talk about his new book, The Fourth Pillar, Modern Stoicism and the Philosophy of High Performance. I'm Harry's publisher at Pan Macmillan. Harry, welcome back to Life on the Line.
Thanks, Alex. Good to be back.
So, Harry, given that this is a military podcast, we're going to discuss philosophy in a wartime context specifically, thanks to your new book. But before we get to that, can you give us a quick summary of what is this book, what's it about, and why did you write it?
Well, the fourth pillar, I guess, is an extension of 11 Bats, in as much as 11 Bats was my best attempt to summarise my career, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and hopefully leave something for young soldiers, young men and women who are thinking about Defence Force or serving, and also for people who are in service and thinking about their, what's next. In a large way, the fourth pillar is that, but extended into questioning what that means for athletes, artists, and analysts in the corporate world, for example. It's a summary of my life since leaving the military, the lessons I've learned, where I've seen the lessons applicable from the military into these other domains. But I go further than that and actually lay out in the pages of the book my thinking around high performance programs and how suited they are for preparing people not only for performance, for the parts of their lives, but also for their whole life. And one of the issues we see today is transition in athletes or veterans and more broadly as well, emergency medicine doctors, physicians, even some corporates, trying to make sense of their life beyond, the sacrifice it takes to reach the top level. That's the match of the day version. And I break it up into a few different pots. And the first one is just discussing my journey, the first part of 3 volumes, if you will, or parts to the book. My influences, philosophical and training influences, some of the books I read and that set me up, I think. In the middle part of the book, I talk specifically about high performance programs and my view of the world. They're basically most high performance programs are based on a framework, a biopsychosocial framework, 3 pillars, if you will, and that's where the name comes from. I think that there's a fourth philosophical pillar that goes to, as I just mentioned, setting people up to have a satisfying life as well as a satisfying career. And then the last part, I somewhat clumsily, but I think it kind of worked out really well. Try to offer, what does a philosophical pillar look like, and what are the muscles of the mind or consciousness that we can practice to keep us grounded through our careers of high performance, and then at the end leave that career and walk into a flourishing, full, thriving life, resplendent with its social connections. And I think that's part of the problem, as I said, about transitioning at the end of these careers. So I think that's a broad summary for what is, I think, quite a larger book than I envisaged to start with.
Absolutely. I mean, in podcasts like this, on the bookshelves, in stores, in the self-help category, there's been so much, I think, discourse the last 4 or 5 years on topics. Yes, those key buzzwords like resilience and all that, but whatever broader framework you choose, the focuses are on those aspects of self, the biological, the psychological, the social. Different people have put different labels on those layers or those pillars, but they're the core 3 that are looked at time and time again. And what felt really fresh and invigorating was that you've gone, okay, cool. Those things, we know that. We know, yep, eat better, sleep well, surround yourself with good people, find purpose. Like, those things are there. Yes, we know that. That's good stuff. We've been taught those lessons to death. But what's missing for that real sense of purpose or drive or belonging or a sense of just how to view and experience the world is philosophy. And then, of course, you overlay that with that high performance program lens. But from your own journey there, Harry, when did your interest in philosophy develop? Were you contemplating some of these larger, deeper questions of life between contacts and deployed to the Middle East, or in training, or at the bottom of a glass of Guinness before you go on stage, the externals, or is it a more recent interest of yours?
I think it's been there since the start. I finishing year 12, I had an understanding that philosophy was part of psychology, which is what I what I was looking at and reading about at the time to take up at university. So it was always there, and my father was a reader. So on the bookshelves were books, Plato, Socrates, and Marcus Aurelius, these types of books, lots of Shakespeare, etc. My father was a pretty intellectual kind of guy, a deep reader or big reader. So it was always kind of there, but not really something that I was jumping out of bed with. Gradually followed me along. A lot of the reading that I was doing, historical reading, and then as I joined the military, things like ethics and aesthetics, and in fact, I say in the book, metaphysics and epistemology, all of these, the axiology of life. That sounds strange to be talking about that, but they ground us in how to interact with life and death, or how to think about life and death. I even mentioned in the book when I interacted with nefarious characters, with bad guys, with people we were fighting. At some stage, you come together, how you can position your experience and navigate conversations with those. And also, there's a restorative piece too. I think philosophy gives us great consolation. It's a therapy. It's a tonic that can help us resolve or view at our trauma and challenges of warfighting through a really grounding lens, or a lens that allows us to ground ourselves in ethics, whether that's virtue ethics or deontology, or whether it's kind of the rules or the Kantian type of ethics, and understanding these things, I think, brings great consolation, and it certainly did for me. And then more recently, when I was in the high performance program at the unit, and maybe a few years before that, when I started turning my mind to how we could prepare and restore our operators better, there was always something missing. And a guy by the name of Percy Cerity, my great mentor from the grave, was barking at me through the pages of his readings and his writings that the missing piece is philosophy. That, in fact, I agree with him. I'm led by him when he says that our philosophical conditioning, which like our physical conditioning, social conditioning, mental conditioning, if you like, that's the language I use in the book. There's a philosophical conditioning. And what is that? It's the qualia of our experience of life and how we view the world. And there is a quality to that. And I think we've all ebbed and flowed with how we see the world on a daily, monthly, yearly basis. And I think you can work at that 100% just as you can the body. So Percy tuned me into this, and that was the missing piece. I feel that a program that, in my mind, when I think about it and talk about programming for corporates and et cetera, I feel that is something that's really important and core to how humans develop themselves.
Marcus Aurelius says, waste no time arguing how good a man should be one. So you've said that you started having this interest from that young age in year 12, and you had that interest in psychology from a young age. Can we talk about how you applied these kind of principles, and let's use ethics, that school in particular, and how you saw it applied, how you applied it yourself during your time in the military, how it's great to have those ideas, those thought bubbles, those academic, rigorous discourses, but then there's the on-the-ground reality of that. How do you marry those two when they have clash as opposed to have synergy?
Yeah, very late in my career, we were in a pretty heavy contact meters from a very belligerent enemy. It was a senior Taliban commander meeting with a couple of dozen bad guys defending the position. Out of the middle of this contact, machine gun fire, and we were returning fire, and over only tens of meters, a young boy and an old man wandered through the middle of the gunfight onto our side of a riverbank, which was just a small little tributary that we were shooting across, or were fighting across. And he'd been severely shot, severely wounded with head trauma. His brain was exposed, so he was a Pri 1 casualty. You know, if you look at the Kantian ethical model, the rules of war, kind of laws of armed conflict, following the rules allows you to ignore that young gentleman. You might give some first aid, but you want to fight the fight. That's the mission. That's the number one thing that you should be. And then there's consequentialist ethics as well, where what are the consequences of your decisions versus what are the rules that you can apply. And those two positions, whether they're deontology or Kantian type ethics, seem not enough for me, because they can come into contest with virtue ethics, which is about character. What is meaningful to you, and what is the right thing to do for you. And you mentioned Aurelius about, there's a time to not stop talking about being a good bloke and a good man and make good decisions and actually do it. And that experience for me really captures the ethical triangulation, if you like, of ethics that a guy by the name of Dean Peter Baker talks about. It's not a new concept or his concept, but there are degrees of what is right and wrong. And for me, at that time, at the end of my career, I was tired, I was morally burnt out, I suppose that happens to you. And I chose a virtue ethics, if you will, approach to my decision making. And the other part to this is that no matter whether it's based on rules or consequences or your own character, post events and decisions, we get decisions wrong. A lot of decisions I've made, or many decisions I've made, have resulted in the wounding or killing of civilians. There's no doubt about that. That's warfare. It's inescapable, unfortunately. But to contemplate after these moments on what is ethics, these little frameworks help you pick around the edges of that. A lot of us just sat in ROE briefs and laws of armed conflict briefs and just rolled our eyes. And it just seems remiss of me that we do that or allow our operators to do that, because there is a consequence to this on the individual, no matter whether you're the decision maker or you're the doer of that decision. And I think that for me is a really practical way. Now, I've applied that in many instances, and whether that be before, during, or after. And it also allows you to ask courageous questions of the leaders above you as well. If you have thought through this, say, well, hold on, what do the rules truly say? Or what does this say about me if I'm going to look for efficiencies on the battlefield or collateral damage? These are euphemisms that describe pretty words for ugly things, if you like, and we shouldn't just blindly follow along. And I think that's something I've learned as a soldier.
I think there's a lot of discourse on things like accountability, which is important, but accountability is not the same as a rigorous ethical re-examination of what did and did not occur, what decisions were and were not made, and that ethical level applies at the political level that sort of created the overarching context of situations that you were in, to say the officer, or that sort of more strategic level, and down to the on the ground level. There's ethical challenges and to debate and consider at all those points in the timeline and at all those levels. And it is that debrief. How do you sit down and examine the aftermath, but then also actively applying those lessons in the next circumstance, so you're not going through the same circus again?
Well, the reflexivity, and that's part of philosophical thinking and practices, the reflexivity of going through an event and then coming out and sitting down and unpacking that at a moral level or an ethical level, then prepares you better for the next time. And particularly in Afghanistan and other wars, you're kind of continually going back out to fight. And I think that it's an important part. Again, there's protective factors, and Dean Baker talks about moral armouring. And I think these are protective practices as we go, just like you do at the gym, go and build strength and conditioning to fight. We should also practice thinking for ourselves. Just because we're under orders doesn't mean we can't think for ourselves. And Australian soldiers are actually renowned for being a little bit disobedient when the time comes, but I'm not sure it's so much for the ethical part. It's just common sense. And in a large part, being philosophical has a lot to do with just common sense. And I'm sure everyone would agree we do with a bit more common sense in the world right now.
I think we certainly could. And it would be negligent not to acknowledge, of course, having a discussion about ethics in a warfighting zone is a different conversation in a post-Brereton Report era than a pre-Brereton Report era. And of course, that war and ethics, that is a timeless conversation. There's nothing new in that. It's just now everyone has a podcast to discuss it, or they can more freely access the printing press to write their thoughts. But it's, on that.
But we went, just to pick you up on that we have, part of the point I'm making in the book is that we have ignored the virtue ethics or morality. It's a slight a big distinction between what's moral and what's ethical. Moral is based on kind of social norms and more, that's where the root word, or moralia, and ethics is about character. So what does that mean? Moral standards can change over time. If you think about the 60s and 1880s and 1780s and etc. to now, moral standards have kind of changed a little bit here and there. Whereas characters, age old, the kind of stoic virtues of prudence and moderation and courage and justice and to be good in the world hasn't changed a great deal. Virtue ethics is something that I think when we're teaching those more morally aligned standards for the military or for the the consequential and deontological ethics, if we're leaning only on those things, we're letting our soldiers down, because what's good for them to do in their own minds is equally important. We shouldn't be asking people to do things, and I think the Brereton Report is a good case in point here, asking and forcing individuals to do things that is completely against their ethical core. That's another motivator for me. Bring this a bit more to the surface, I guess.
And ethics is one of many schools of philosophy discussed in the book. I want to make this clear. It's not just a warfighting and ethics book. It's much broader than that. You touched on earlier. It's for the athlete, the analyst, the aesthete, and then also the operator. It's a book for many people. And, some of the schools examined, yes, there's, of course, Stoicism. There's the sort of Spartan culture and lessons there. Percy Cerutty's portmanteau, Stotan obviously comes into play. And then the more classic schools like metaphysics, aesthetics, ethics, epistemology, logic, the list goes on. And you write to the reader, not assuming their background or their interest or why they've come to this book. It's that universal sense of something's missing. And there might just be the family man that's actually looking for some sense of grounding in their lives. The thing they have in common, this hypothetical reader, is their need to build that philosophical conditioning, to build the muscle of the mind and not just the body. And that has the practical outcomes in dealing with, say, that deep ethical dilemma that we were just talking about, or it could be in some other aspect of life. Can you talk a bit more about that building of the muscle mind? Because again, we talk a lot about building the body, and building the inner self in some ways, like those social layers and that psychological aspects, yes, but how that philosophical aspect of the mind muscle differentiates itself.
I'm a small p bar side philosopher, right? I'm not a qualified philosopher. I don't propose to it, but I absolutely believe that we're all philosophers, and that's an ability we all have to wonder, to awe, to philosophize about ourselves, other things. And I feel that capacity, ability within us has diminished. It's been impoverished in the modern world, withered to some extent. We use mechanistic metaphors, the brain is a computer, the heart is a pump. These are simple things, but metaphors are just so important. And I coming back to the mind or consciousness, whatever that is, I've got no idea. I have a fumbled attempt to kind of explain what it means to me in the book, but I certainly don't have the corner store on that. I think that modernity throws at us through information age and data and advertising, the insult of advertising and marketing. It's just, it's like pollutants into our mind, just as the pollutants in the air pollute our lungs and insult our lungs. The sedentary lifestyle insults our physical selves, and technology removes us from each other and ultimately from ourselves, I think. And we've forgotten that philosophy and natural metaphors and the natural metaphors of philosophy can help detoxify our consciousness, this quality of experience that we have. If you think about what your consciousness is, whatever it is, whether it comes to you, it radiates out of you, permitted, emitted, whatever it is, filtered, there's a quality to that. And if we sit and contemplate on that, we can think about it. And so philosophical practices, the philosophers, the ancient philosophers and not so ancient philosophers, but particularly those, tell us or allude to the practices which I try to summarize in the book, and push back against this notion that humans are optimizable machines. They're not. They're no more optimizable in my mind than a tree or a forest. And unless you want to bring a bulldozer to a forest and optimize it, that's the kind of metaphor I'm trying to get away from. The metaphor I like about our consciousness is the streams of the mountainsides filter the water and make it drinkable and make it pure. And I think through what I outline as 8 philosophical practices, philosophy as a practice, not a posture, I think are things we must return to, adopt as if we would adopt them as gym exercises for the body, or mental skills or mental schema that we can use for the mind, CBT, for example, or social practices that we can use to engage. I think these 8 privileges, as I call them, because they are privileges of a Western world, to be patient and take time to contemplate is a great privilege.
It certainly is. And we also acknowledge the irony, as we have many times in our chats off mic, Harry, of, marketing, advertising, it's a pollutant. Now we need to go promote this book, etc.
That's right.
It's what we must do.
And that's okay. And it's a key point. I'm not saying in the book that we shouldn't have science, we shouldn't have evidence, we shouldn't have mechanistic metaphors, that we shouldn't progress profit and we shouldn't look to train the parts, but it's out of balance. It's all about the performance, and we forget about the whole of life. And bring back to my original point, we can do both. We can have elite performers at throwing and kicking, but we can also have elite human beings. And as Percy Cerity says, teaching people this training intelligence, which is at the base of a philosophical condition, and treating that as they go, is actually the most important part, because athletes, high performers, in analysts or artists or operators, we actually need these people to go on to their greatness, to represent to fulfill their greatest job in life, and that is to be a great citizen. That I think that's the number one thing. We've kind of lost that. We're fragmenting. And the philosophers do allude to this as well. One thing I wanted to say was that it's somewhere along the line, and it kind of ties into ethics and metaphysics, etc., and life. We became obedient to a set of rules that tell us how to think. In fact, it's one of the most subversive things a human being can do is to think for themselves. But when you think about it, bosses want you just to kind of play your role and not think too much, just play your role, do what I'm asking you to do what the machine needs you to do. In a way, I'm calling back a first human revolution, if you will, shaking my old man's fist at the fifth or fourth or whatever the bloody industrial revolution, and say, you can think for yourself, and but you can still play a role, and I hope that comes through in the book.
I just pictured you as Monty Python's Brian telling the crowd, you are all individuals.
Yeah, that's right.
One other aspect of the book I really like is that you stress the point that whether it's health, advertising, or discourse, or whatever it might be, is talking about getting back to nature, like it's a holiday destination to visit, or even there was something that came up the other week, I swear I read that, like, oh no, you need 10 minutes in nature a day is sort of what you need for minimum health requirements. Nature is not somewhere to visit. We are of nature. Being in nature rather than visiting it is essential.
Yeah, it's ridiculous, isn't it? We're now permitted in nature. There's signs to tell you whether you can visit it. There's timings and what we should do, and that's because we humans can't be trusted, I guess, or by ourselves in the middle of. But I think that we are of nature, and we've forgotten that. We've disappeared the stars from the skies in big cities, and if anyone has. And this is the best example, I think. If anyone recently or can remember, and for those listening who live out in the country, are very lucky, a full starlit night where you can see the oblique angle of the Milky Way in Australia or anywhere else in the world. And it's so bright that you can almost read a newspaper. You can certainly read a newspaper headline. And just to look up or lay on your back and look up at the sky and wonder, that muscle, and that is, I'm using a metaphor here because I'm not too sure what it really is, but just to be connected. And it's not hippie, it's not fluffy, it's actually an elite practice, and I think we've lost it. And to sit in awe and wonder is something that brings great well-being to ourselves. It's strange, even going for a drive in the country is relaxing, enough. But it's the complexity, the perfect and beautiful complexity of nature that I think soothes our minds. And I don't need help on this. There's plenty of research and evidence to support time in nature. It can be difficult in the city. Another ridiculous thing is that a walk around the block's now deemed exercise, which I think, that's another example or indictment on the malady of modernity. But even just going into the park and engaging with nature in a meaningful way, it's not just going down the park and playing on your phone. Leave your bloody phones out of it and go and just look at the majesty of a beautiful big tree in Fitzroy Garden or something. Again, this isn't fluffy stuff. It isn't hippie. These are practices that have forged who humans are over these hundreds of thousands of years. And the reason I think I make the point in the book that one of the reasons I think we're all suffering, which I think everyone could agree that there's a crisis, a health and well-being crisis, or maybe not a crisis, but it's certainly not as good as all the technology and science promised us it would be. Part of that is that we've removed ourselves from nature, and into that void is doubt, internalization, fragmentation, and I think this is nature plays a huge role, or the lack of in that.
Well, listeners, I hope you're convinced to wage war against the malady of modernity by taking a copy of Harry's book in print or on Kindle to a park, or if you're doing audio, have your phone at least on Do Not Disturb while you listen to it, or even do it while running. Harry, I want to finish our chat with this quote from near the end of the book. Perhaps you could comment on the sentiment. You are a Homo sapiens, a thinking human or wise human. Your ability to be philosophical, to search for, recognize, and, if necessary, fight for knowledge, truth, the value in yourself, others, and the natural world around you is your greatest endowment.
Yeah, I think, I hope it says it all, Alex. I actually originally wrote that piece for my son. You might remember in the earlier drafts, I wanted to leave him something. I've dedicated the book to Henry, my beautiful son. It's amazing what simple practices, philosophical practices like walking and contemplation, slowly on your heels, not on your toes in a rush, and having something like, I want to write a letter to my son to contemplate on, and then get out of the way of your mind and let it come forth. And I hope that that last part of the paragraph that you just read out, or the last part of the book you just read out, captures that. I think it does. It's a dare I say it, and boastfully, it's a beautiful sentiment, and I'm glad that made it into the book. And my son's happy that I sent in the letter with that sentiment.
It's a beautiful part indeed, Harry. Well, Harry, our friendship started about 7 odd years ago when we recorded the first of these podcasts, and now here we are all these years later, recording a third one and having done a book together. So who knows what the future holds, but good luck to you good luck to us with the publication of The Fourth Pillar. Thanks for coming back on Life on the Line to talk with me today about it.
My pleasure, Alex. Thank you.
The Fourth Pillar is out now in print, ebook and audiobook, narrated by Harry. Here's a bit more about the book. Something is missing in our lives. Australian Special Forces veteran and corporate psychologist Harry Moffitt has trained and worked with the best in the military, sport and corporate realms. He has seen up close what makes a champion tick and what makes another squander the gifts they've been given. It comes down to purpose, self-awareness and the quality of our lived experience. It comes down to philosophy. In a world saturated by self-help, we all know the importance of the physical, psychological, and social pillars of human performance. But as a society, we've forgotten the crucial fourth pillar, our philosophical self. The fourth pillar resurrects this critical ingredient of a life well lived, providing us with the tools to help navigate our anxious and uncertain world. By unpacking the ancient wisdom of the Stoics, the Spartans, and beyond, coupled with hard-earned lessons from the battlefield and boardroom, to sporting greats and NASA trailblazers, Moffitt reveals the path to true high performance, wisdom, and fulfillment. Harness your potential and take back control. Follow this podcast on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at Life on the Line Podcast, on Twitter at LOTL Pod, and on LinkedIn at Thistle Productions. Our website is www.lifeonthelinepodcast.com. Life on the Line is brought to you by Thistle Productions. Artwork by Big Cat Design. Theme music by Dan Van Werkhoven. Closing music, The Hell Beyond, by The Externals. Thanks for listening, and lest we forget.
A man sure walks slow, might his step be your last. It can steal the mind quickly, and it can harden your heart. And you yearn for your family, and you long for your wife, and all that you're missing from a wonderful life. But out here I'm a soldier and a long way from home, and I gave up those comforts a long time ago. Out here in the dirt and the heat and the dry, there's no time for nostalgia unless it blankens your mind. Just then I looked round and I caught Rowdy's eyes, and it snapped me back quicker than he raised up his sides. He squeezed off some rounds from behind a mud wall as I dived to me guts and I started to crawl. Well, I've tried to forget how I tried, but I'll never forget how the fear stole my mind. The cornfields erupted. Shit scared with self-doubt. My throat was bone dry and me heart filled me mouth. As the shots cracked around us, I remember the high, but it wasn't excitement, I was just terrified. The steel tore through clothing, mud walls, trees and flesh, as I emptied my bag towards nothing at best. And as I crawled forward and I looked through my sights, I turned and saw Rowdy give a wink and a smile. He shouted with me as he sprung to his feet with his gun up and firing out into the green and the dirt all around him like rain on a pond as he made his way into the hell just beyond. Oh. Well, I've tried to forget how I've tried, but it's hard to forget such a beautiful and followed through machine guns and fire. I remember the dust, how the grip cut in the eyes. We battled and fought through the streets, maze and mud. And when I reached Rowdy, he was covered in blood. I crawled up beside him and I laid by his side. Not sure it was sweat or tears stinging his eyes. He grabbed for my hand and he winced through a smile as the din all around him fell silent and quiet. Oh, well, I've tried to forget how I've tried, but I'll never forget the day Rowdy died. Bird dusted off, me best mate in a bag, as I licked at a rollie and we passed round a drag. We picked up and moved, we were dog-tired and beat. We were the dreaming awake and the walking asleep. As I sat with a beer, looking over the dash, and I drank and I pondered the shit day we'd had. But nothing like Rowdy, so I raised up my glass and I whispered to old mate it was over too fast.